Hello everyone, I hope you're excited for this LearnSTEM episode as I am, because not only is it the first LearnSTEM episode of the school year, but it's also approaching the full month. And as you can see through this entire video, I have a lot of orange going on. Just as a disclaimer, this video is not going to cover anything too in-depth into 3D graphing because it is a complicated topic, but instead we're just going to go lightly over some different subject areas. So, with that out of the way, grab your coffee, grab your pumpkin pie or whatever you have laying around at home, and let's get into some 3D graphing. Let's get learning. Before we get into 3D vectors, I'm going to give you a brief introduction into 3D graphing. Basically, it's just using computer programs that allow us to graph in the third dimension. That is just 2D, but adding another dimension, the z-axis. The reason why I am talking about vectors is because they're a fundamental concept of not only 3D graphing, but of university-level physics and multivariable calculus. So if you're taking those courses, this is a good video for you to watch. And as you probably already know, vectors constitute a magnitude and a direction, giving them widely applicable use cases in physics and mathematics. One of these use cases is force vectors, or a multitude of force vectors, and I'll show you what it looks like on the screen around me somewhere. So, even if the graph on the screen has multitudes of vectors that are of the same magnitude, they differ in direction. You can get a pretty good general gist of what a 3D vector graph looks like. What you have probably already seen in your high school physics class is 2D vectors, and you have probably manipulated them using addition, subtraction, the dot product, and the cross product. And if you have already dealt with 2D vectors, you know how highly applicable their formulas and use cases are in everyday life. For instance, you can take that same dot product and cross product and make it apply to 3D vectors. As you probably know, the traditional dot product is the vector 1 times vector 2 times the cosine of the angle between them. And already, if that seems like it's just an equation that's only applicable to 2D vectors, you would actually be wrong, because that equation can be used in 3D vectors as it is. But if you want to break that equation down into some more analytic components, I can do that for you right now. Basically, what you've already done when you break vectors down into their components, you can basically translate that same idea and apply it to the dot product. We'll get to the cross product soon enough. Simply, you would just break down vector A and vector B into their x, y, and z components. Even though the actual dot product equation is easier to utilize than this breaking down of the vectors into the components, it's just another tool that you can have under your tool belt to make 3D graphing a little bit more easy. And for the cross product, it is not just scalar, meaning that it has a direction associated with it, so it's a little bit more complicated. So I'm not going to try to say this one out loud, because that would not only confuse me, but it would most likely confuse you too. So, with it on the screen somewhere, like before, I'm going to explain why it's different. Basically, the cross product takes into account not only magnitude and direction, like I said before. What I'm trying to say by this is that if you're multiplying two vectors, the new resultant vector using the cross product would be perpendicular to the plane that the two vectors originated in, meaning that you not only have to take into account the magnitude, but also the direction. Lastly, in this topic of vectors, it's also important to understand one last thing. You might have been confused. What do the I, J's, and K's stand for in the equation earlier? Well, actually, those are unit vectors. Unit vectors are basically a vector in one of the three main directions in 3D graphing: the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis. Basically, this means that unit vectors have a magnitude of 1, meaning that they just represent direction. So I is representative of the x-axis, J is representative of the y-axis, and K is representative of the z-axis. Now, after we're done with discussing 3D vectors, and hopefully that has allowed you to more easily comprehend what a 3D graphing system is, now we can actually go on to what 3D graphing looks like and why it is applicable in calculus, and physics. Now that you understand 3D graphs, you might be wondering, why is this such a big deal? Well, you probably think that that's a stupid question to ask because you probably understand why it's a big deal, because we live in a 3D world. But now let's go into the application of 3D graphing. The simple addition of a new dimension allows for a plethora of more complicated mathematical equations to come from. For instance, now that we have a second variable to control, it allows mathematicians and physicists to input more complicated setups and use more variables to actually account for real-life variables. One of the most famous 3D graphs out there is the Lorentz attractor. You can see it on my screen right there. Basically, the reason why this is so famous is because the Lorentz attractor was, I think, originally purposed to try to give 2D fluid motion. It was trying to track that using a deterministic approach. That basically means that it had an input of a known set of variables, and you were able to track, well, supposedly you were able to track the future occurrences or the future conditions that those variables would be put in. However, what Lorentz found is that it's not only often impossible to find the exact value of a certain variable, but if those values are off even by the most minute amount, it can throw off future calculations. For instance, this is known as, in simple terms, the butterfly effect, and it represents chaos. Another application of 3D graphing, which you can see on my screen right there, is called the torus knot. In mathematics, the torus knot is widely applicable due to its use in topology. In simple terms, this is how a mathematician can manipulate a set of inputs and create something that looks like that. You might be asking, outside of physics and mathematics, what is 3D graphing useful for? Well, the first thing that came to mind when I asked myself this question is 3D printing. That has it in the name, right? And while 3D graphing is not as useful in actual applications as a CAD software, it's still useful in the proof of concept. A second instance outside of STEM, which 3D graphing is widely used in, is CGI. You know, the cool fire effects or explosions that you see in the movies? That's all from 3D graphing. Lastly, 3D graphing is also widely used in the biomedical sciences. For instance, it can help an aspiring doctor understand what DNA sequences look like, or something of that nature. As we come to the end of today's episode, I hope you learned something about 3D graphing. And if you are inspired to try to make your own 3D graphs, because they can look quite cool, I recommend that you use a grapher tool that comes native on Macs, known as Grapher. If you don't have a Mac, or you just want an easier graphing tool, there's something known as GeoGebra, and you just use the 3D version of that graphing tool. With that out of the way, that brings me to the end of this video. Keep on learning. Liam, out.